Chinese have a lot to be proud of, considering how much progress their country has achieved over the years, not just domestically, but its growing influence on the international stage. But on the 70th anniversary since the People's Republic was born, we explore the question: how fairly and accurately is the foreign media presenting China to their global audiences? Welcome to a special edition of The Point, coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. For the Chinese in China and around the world, this October the 1st is truly historic. Exactly 70 years ago, in 1949, the People's Republic was born. Under the leadership of the Communist Party of China, or CPC, a country transformed itself from a land ravaged by foreign aggression and civil war, a land of poverty, hunger and backwardness, into the world's second-largest economy. China not only managed to feed its huge population, which stands at nearly 1.4 billion today, but also to feed them well. Just imagine what otherwise it would mean to the region and to the world. Between 1952 and 2018, China's economy expanded by 175 times to reach 90 trillion renminbi. That's about 13 trillion US dollars. China's per capita GDP reached over 9,700 US dollars from minimal levels. In 1950, the life expectancy of the average Chinese was about 45 years old, according to the World Health Organization. By last year, it had reached 77 years old. 70 years ago, more than 80% of the population was illiterate. Nowadays, according to UNICEF, 99% of Chinese children between the ages of 6 and 12 are on track to complete their 9 years of compulsory education. China is also home to the world's largest higher education system, producing millions of university graduates every year. China has been shifting from a major recipient of foreign aid to becoming a major donor. It's now the second largest contributor to both the United Nations regular budget and the UN's peacekeeping budget, second only to the United States. And of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, China now provides the largest number of peacekeepers, who have served a total of 35,000 times. Don't get me wrong, there are still big challenges. For instance, 16 million Chinese people still live under the 1.5 US dollar a day poverty line set by the United Nations. 9,700 USD per capita is also just a fraction of that of developed countries. So there is a lot to be proud of for the Chinese looking back, but looking ahead, we still have a long way to go. As the date of October the 1st drew near, coverages from international media mostly focused on the challenges China faces and the military parade at the heart of Beijing to mark the occasion. I ask, aren't there positive trends or noteworthy progress that are worth highlighting? With that in mind, today we'll dissect a few recent stories about China. Then I'll be joined by my colleagues from home and abroad to discuss how China can be portrayed through a fairer prism. Looking at Western coverages more broadly, we tend to focus on the major news outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post and others, and couldn't help notice this time the overwhelmingly negative light in which they cast China. For example, from earlier this year, the New York Times published this piece pegged to the 70th anniversary. The headline says Chinese president or the Chinese leader is nervous, which delivers an immediate negative message to the brain of the reader, as if there are serious issues facing the country, and it continues from there. I would say leading 1.4 billion people is no easy task, and a lot of attention has to be paid so that the country is on the right track. But does that mean nervousness? I don't know. The Washington Post published a story earlier this year in which the journalist wrote that in its 70th year, China is battening down the hatches as if it were a ship in stormy seas. Again, signaling negativity to readers. The Communist Party of China has a burning need to be more defensive. We've also looked at international news agencies, which can be even more influential in shaping global public opinion. In following their coverages, I feel they've approached China's 70th anniversary with a certain dose of mockery. On the military parade, for instance, sure, the Chinese are commemorating the date with a huge parade in the heart of Beijing. Nevertheless, in the run-up to this event, the news agencies have focused disproportionately on how China has imposed restrictions on fuel, fireworks, kites, drones, and even pigeons in the name of security. Take this Reuters piece, for example, which was published by the New York Times and other clients around the world. The headlines set the tone. Beijing clams down on fuel, firework, sales ahead of China's 70th anniversary. The verb clam down implies heavy-handedness, restriction. And the first paragraph says it's part of a series of measures intended to keep the Chinese capital safer and cleaner. Farther down, the author notes Beijing's efforts to ensure blue skies for the event and reminds readers previous such showpiece events have been preceded by curbs on industry and traffic in and around the Chinese capital in a bid to reduce pollution and ensure a blue sky backdrop. Now, you may think these are fair criticisms, but such article didn't include a line or two from a Chinese official or an ordinary Chinese citizen to either defend or justify or explain about the moves. In fact, imagine this were your big day, as if you are a parent planning the wedding of your only daughter. Wouldn't you also want to do everything perfectly within your power to ensure that this day is perfect, that nothing goes wrong? But you know, about the pigeons. By the way, I see birds every day from my home. I don't know what they're talking about. Maybe on a particular day this was the case, but such stories, I hope they wouldn't give people the impression that that is the kind of daily norm here in the Chinese capital. Well, let's be fair. Not all foreign coverages about China are negative. One positive example that we found came from The Guardian. It's a piece where the journalist humanized ordinary Chinese, presenting us as real people. Coincidentally, it's written by the same Beijing correspondent whom I critiqued in May after she wrote a largely negative story about Beijing hosting the world's largest horticultural exposition. Rather than focusing on the colorful array of global gardening styles and Beijing's effort to increase ecological awareness, the journalist took a more cynical approach, portraying the expo as allegedly one more Chinese effort to exert its diplomatic soft power. This time, though, to mark the 70th anniversary, the journalist took a different tag. In this May feature story, the writer explores the lives of ordinary Chinese and how dramatically they've changed over the years, in many ways for the better. The headline contains a positive word, hope, and the introduction credits China with a transformation that is, quote, nothing short of miraculous. While the analysis includes points that some Chinese will find negative and unnecessary, it does present a more nuanced picture than the black and white way in which China is often portrayed. As the article notes, quote, the picture is not so clear-cut. For example, the first Chinese profiled by the name of Zhang Xizhen describes a life full of hardship, yet praises China for its stability today, a cherished value for so many Chinese. A second woman profiled hails how the new generations of Chinese have many more choices in life than she had when she was younger, and so on. So whatever you think of this article itself, at least the story is making a fairer, more balanced approach to its overall coverage of China. China may have plenty of negatives to highlight in some journalists' eyes, yet there are also a few positives, aren't there? Is there a lack of critical thinking skills or a failure of it? Are they unable to or unwilling to muster any empathy for how far China has come? Well, Western journalists might be doing a disservice to their audience because China isn't going away. Its global presence, through partnerships with foreign governments, companies, organizations, and foreign people, is multiplying. So just as China must do a better job explaining itself to the world, so too should the foreign media take greater responsibility to help the outside world better understand China and the Chinese as fairly and accurately as possible. You're watching a special edition of The Point with me, coming to you from Beijing. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, I'll ask several guests my counterparts from China, India and the US to talk about the differences and possibly similarities in reporting China from a Chinese and foreign perspective. Welcome back to this special edition of The Point, and I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by three guests. They are Jaime Flor-Cruz, a professor with the Peking University. He was the former CNN bureau chief in China for 14 years. And Atul Aneja, associate editor of The Hindu from India. Last but not least, Wang Cong, reporter from Global Times. Welcome to The Point. So I have given a very long monologue, and that's through a lot of media observation. So what is your first impression after all of the things that I try to dissect? Jaime, for instance, do you think I have captured the picture in a more or less accurate way, or have I been too critical, too negative on the Western media?
I think, of course, you took the China perspective of that, and, it's fair enough. I think I've heard that criticism before. There are valid points. I think we all share the need to be fair and balanced, but you spoke of the one word, nuance. We journalists from wherever we come from try to, are seeking to capture the nuance of a story. And, doing the China story, it's very hard for foreign journalists to capture the nuances. It's the easiest way to just, do the black and white story.
Why is it hard? Is it because of the language? Is it because of the ideological differences? Or is it because of the working environment, which some of them find not be very favorable sometimes?
It's all of it.
It's all of it.
I mean, language, culture, it's very complex. China is a very complex country and society with a long history. So we need to invest efforts and to study and find out where China is coming from. But at the same time, as you mentioned, on the other side, it's also how much access the foreign journalists get. While, China needs to improve its delivery of the story, we, the foreign journalists, also need to improve how we cover the story. Mm-hmm. And it remains a big challenge.
It remains a big challenge. And journalists come and go, so it's it's an ongoing challenge. Atul, you have been in China for 4 years. How did you overcome such barriers, and did you find it difficult in the beginning? I don't know, how is your Chinese proficiency level? Is that a factor, for instance?
I think more than that is where you come from, because I come from a developing country, and the India and China journey began almost together, because we became independent in 47 and China became the PRC in 1949. So it was easier for me to step into the Chinese shoes and see it from the inside, rather than from a Westerner, typically, who would look at it from the outside. I think that's where I connected with China, and I had no difficulty in understanding, not exactly endorsing what was happening, but at least understanding it with empathy. And then if I was critical, it was from China to do better, not that there should be a new system, that China should be something else and should lose its own political and cultural identity.
I do want to ask Jaime, because you come from this background, which is very interesting, right? Yes. You come from originally the Philippines, right, but you work for an American, international.
So, like Atul, I also have this perspective of the developing country. I come from the Philippines. We share a lot of the problems that the challenges that China face now. So I also can empathize and can appreciate how difficult the challenges are. But also, I have a longer perspective, having lived and worked in China for 48 years. So I tend to look at China, what it was and what it is now. And so the comparison, it's easier for China to come out positively, because I've seen China in a very backward and isolated state. Yeah. So I see and appreciate the small changes, the small improvements that China has made, and in fact they were not small.
So from your interaction and your observation, I know Global Times pay a lot of attention to the Western media as well. What is your impression what I have come across, what I have concluded, for instance, in the opening monologue, do you have similar observation, or do you see things even more critically, that there is a greater amount of hostility? What is your observation?
So first of all, I want to respond to Hamei's comments a little bit. Yes, I understand that this is a very challenging task to cover the full picture of China, right? However, that's not what we're talking about here. To get a full, balanced, fair picture of China, there are journalistic standards you can follow to tackle that.
So
However,
are you
what we're
saying
talking
some
about is
Western
there's
journalists
something
are
that,
not
yes,
up to par with professional standards?
That's what I'm saying. Yes, I think there's the access issue, there's the language issue. However, it doesn't explain that they're one-sided. Now, most reports doesn't explain their one-sided stories and bias. I think most of that comes from not because of the challenge, the reality. It comes from, the ideological bias, and then also, more importantly, I think this bias towards sensationalism and the conflict in Western journalism, Western media.
Western media is a very big blanket statement,
right, yes.
So it's not monolithic. Every single person approaches it very differently. So Jaime, how different, for instance, is your approach to, if you will, the majority of other foreign journalists in China? Because I know you're very balanced, very friendly to China as well. You see things in a big picture across a very long period of time. But what about the many others who are new to China, who probably see it in a very different light than you?
I think there's one thing that's shared by many foreign journalists in China, which is the role of journalists. We are not diplomats, we are not public relations companies, and most of us don't work for a government, right? So I think that's one thing that we need to clear.
So you do things from, you naturally criticize, you pick fault, is that what you're trying to?
Meaning that, yes, the journalists consider ourselves as an institution that makes governments, especially the powerful, uncomfortable, and we tend to side with the underdogs, those who are powerless or do not have power, and that's the tendency. I'm not saying everybody does that,
Really?
but I think that is.
You don't agree?
I don't think so. In the United States, the media in the Western, let's talk about U.S. because I lived there, I studied journalism there. The media, how they portray themselves, it's kind of the check of balance, right, in the United States.
Exactly.
They're not underdogs. That's right. They're not.
No, they are for the underdogs. I'm not saying they are the underdogs. They speak for the underdogs. The marginalized people, the people who are powerless, those who are being abused by, especially by institutions like the government. So we tend to be against the government because we look at the governments as, as a source of problems as well as solutions. That's what I mean.
Yeah, I think that's what I can understand too. In the United States, there are different leaning media, right? In the New York Times, it's liberal leaning, and then the Fox News is conservative. But when it comes to China, that's what we're talking about. When it comes to China, my editor-in-chief usually say, all the foreign media is one media organization. So for that, what do you speak of? For that, for example, are you speaking of the underdogs in the United States, or the government, or the interest groups?
Maybe the people who are disadvantaged in China.
That's in China. That's what I'm saying. Yes.
Okay.
Role of journalism in different systems is different. I mean, in the sense that in so-called in a democracy, for example, it is the fourth estate which is meant to pick holes at the government, keep it in check, whereas in other countries, and including mine, I think it's a mixed role. It's partly to pick holes, but partly also to understand that the government also can play a developmental role in the absence of other institutions which are not developed. So you have to have in China, for example, I think it's different, because I do believe that while it is critical of, like for example, environment issues, the Chinese media was critical of it. When I came in 2014, pollution was a big issue. There was a film which was made which was very critical. But at the same time, the state is supposed to be an agency of positive change as well, which is different from different systems. I think that's where the problems arise. When the Western media starts looking at China from their perspective, and not from the Chinese perspective, where the role of the state is very different, what is conceived to be in Western societies. So I think a lot of the conflict comes because of the approach to the state.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to point out a small point that you talked about just now, this in countries of democracy, for instance, and this idea that China is not a democracy, for instance, and that India, but do you put India on which side?
Look, I'm not making a value judgment here
No,
at
I know.
Whether
it's
this
the idea.
system is better than the other.
Yeah,
because China is what it is because of its history, because of certain historical experience. It couldn't have been different. Just as my country has evolved from a certain context and it moved in a certain direction. So it's just happened that way. It's not that the one system is superior to the other.
Yeah, the thing is many people...
It's not right or wrong
I think it's not right or wrong. It's just that...
Yeah, that's what we're talking about. I think we understand the different systems, right? And then there can be, a misunderstandings about the role of media. And I think most people in China get it, in the United States, what the role of media play. What we're saying is that they're not being the same, they're not adherent to the same journalistic standards or, ethics as they do in the United States. For example, when it comes to China, they portray a country, demonize, even in some cases, some extreme cases, a country, and that they're trying to separate. For example, if you say specifically what agency of department, what department did something wrong, that's understandable. But how they write, how they portray China, the communist China did this.
I have a feeling sometimes, if they are talking about for instance, the U.S.'s National Day being a party of some people, their audience would understand very well because they have the context. But when they talk about China, the ordinary men and women, American men and women sitting in front of their TV have not so much of a context. So they tend to be led to believe about China in a very one-dimensional way. I don't know which is... Atul, you are shaking your head or nodding. Are you agreeing or disagreeing?
Yeah, I think, like, for me, I look at it in what has happened this 70 years from a decolonization perspective. That there is something, the revolution took place, and it is actually in the beginning, what we in India said was this is the rise not just of China, but the rise of Asia. And these are two ancient civilizations which are finding their feet again. So I do see the 70 years as a time of real celebration, because we are heading into a more multipolar world, which is good for all of us.
Do the great majority of Indian journalists, when they talk about China's 70th anniversary, do they talk about it in its fair light, or do they also talk about it from, look, that is a celebration, a party of a country that's not a democracy? Because very often Indian journalists, when they talk about China, the very first tag they put is it's not a democracy.
There is a problem, and I can say it very openly, that we have somehow become victim we lost our sense of history and the commonality of 400 years when these were the two big civilizations by one incident which took place in the 1962 war. And the Indian media has still not got over that. And I think the more we engage and more we find areas of commonalities and cooperation, and a new generation comes up, this will disappear over time.
Jaime, so tell us a little bit the mentality. I don't know how much you interact with journalists from Western countries here in Beijing. What is the overall sentiment? Because from my perspective, personal observation, I don't know about you, Wang Cong, is there seems to be really an increasing amount of negativity when it comes to reporting on China. And, actually one of our colleagues is very much abused because he's working for CGTN, for us. So it seems there is a wider gap between them versus us. Is that okay?
I think that it's feeding into the ongoing clash, geopolitical as well as trade clashes. China has been, the focus of demonization, as Wang Song said, a lot of negative feelings, vibes, and reporting that's going on about China. And a lot of that feeds into the old prejudices against China. I think the way out of it is to engage more with our colleagues, with the Chinese colleagues, to understand where we all come from and to find some common language and commonality. I wish that there will be a distinction between being critical and being cynical. I think some stories have fallen into the cynical part. It's fine to be critical, but I think it's not good to be cynical.
Do you think it is welcome, though, if a journalist talks about a bright side of the picture when it comes to talking about China? For instance, last time when I was watching CNN, they were talking about protests in Hong Kong, protesters in Hong Kong singing a song that they believe in, but they did not mention at all over the same period of time they were gathering by people who very much support the SAR government and gathering in a shopping mall and singing the national anthem. So is there some kind of feeling that if you become balanced, or if you highlight the bright side of China, it's not welcome? I hope not, but I'm not sure.
And I think we have to keep in mind this, what we call the gatekeepers. In news organizations, you have journalists on the ground, but also you have editors in the home offices. We call them the gatekeepers. And they play a very crucial role in what kind of stories they commission, and also how these stories are played up. And I hope that China could reach out to these gatekeepers, bring them over, and make them appreciate the nuances of the China story.
Let's look at ourselves as well. How balanced, how nuanced is CGTN? How nuanced is Global Times when it comes to reporting both China and the world? Sometimes I would say I try my best, but it's a subjective thing, you know, so I don't know. I can only say I try my best. What is your struggle there?
I think, you know, at the Global Times, we receive all the criticism, the same, you know, criticism that we have kind of where the hawkish, you know, newspaper, the tabloid, the nationalist, we have received all the characteristics, you know, the bad ones. But I think it's okay. That's kind of part of the interaction that I think Hanei was talking about. There should be more interactions like that. If we did something wrong, if our reporting is not, you know, balanced, I think it's absolutely okay. We welcome you pointed that out, and then we're trying to do our jobs better. And also, when it comes to China too, it's not about negativity and positivity. We're talking about biased and, you know, intentional mistakes. You know, if it's negativity, I think we can take it. Yeah. You know, it's fine.
Okay,
you know.
Okay. Atul, before we wrap up.
Yeah, I do not think it's possible to view reporting outside the geopolitical context. I do believe that if the reporting in the 80s when China was reforming, I think there would have been many more positive stories, because there was possible assumption that China, after its evolution, will become a democracy. But now, when you Western-style democracy. Yeah. But now, when China has taken its own path and the rise of China is imminent, is visible,
and with economic competition,
and in its own paradigm, and that's not which fits into the scheme which was cast for China. So you are already having so much of negativity from the Western media. So I think it's important to understand the geopolitics of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think we should just keep on talking. We will do a better job.
Yeah, we have been trying to invite Western journalists to come on the show. It's not been very easy.
I can understand that, because when Bloomberg first did an interview with us, I heard that there are some in the circle in Beijing were criticizing them. And then, in fact, later, the news organization also interviewed us. So there's, you know, inside among them, you know, the correspondents here, there's also a little competition going on. And so, yeah, I can understand that.
But some do a very good job with Fox News.
Thank you very much. I was very privileged. Many thanks to Jaime Flor-Cruz, professor from Peking University, Atul Anija, associate editor of the Indo, and Wang Song, reporter with Global Times. And with that, we come to the end of this very special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. You can find me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.